Thank you so much, Mr. Abbas, for this very gracious introduction. Honorable Chief Guest, Sir Anirudh Jagannath, respected guests of honor, distinguished fellow panelists, eminent invitees, attendees, and ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here amidst all of you this evening to share this virtual platform. May I ab initio express my sincere gratitude to Binding Bharat and in particular to MS Kanupriya Jaju for this very kind invite extended to me to be here with all of you. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to share this platform. Let me just try and give you a broad spectrum of what I intend presenting over the next 10 odd minutes or so. And I'm sure the guillotine will come in place sooner than later. But be that as it may, in a lighter vein, what I intend doing is to present a very panoramic and a tabletop view from three perspectives. One is to just give you an introduction to what merchant shipping or maritime transportation is all about, then present a perspective of the bilateral relations on the maritime front, say between India and Mauritius, and then scale it up to the regional level. So let me just begin by, stating probably what is a truism or a very given fact. Merchant shipping or maritime transportation, as you're all aware, is by far the most cost-effective, energy-efficient, and eco-friendly mode of transportation. You probably are also aware that it is by far the most salient mode, in as much as 95% by volume and approximately 70% by value of all EXIM trade, which is export-import trade globally, are moved through the global waterways. And I think what is fascinating to note here is that in the midst of this pandemic crisis, which we've all undergone and are currently undergoing, merchant shipping has singularly been one of the very few sectors which have operated nearly at full scale all through. Now, skipping to Indo-Mauritius paradigm, while India is a peninsular country and Mauritius is an island nation, that explains the maritime connect that we've had over the years. India and Mauritius have enjoyed very close and robust relations on a cultural and a trade front. In fact, it dates back to the year 1760. We established diplomatic relations with Mauritius way back in 1948, which is a good 2 decades prior to Mauritius coming to being as a state. And I'm subject to correction by Sir Anirudh Jagannath here, if I've got my facts right. Now, then let me just profile to you India's maritime sector. India ranks amongst the top 20 nations in terms of the diversity and the strength of its merchant shipping fleet. It has one of the best track records in terms of maritime safety, security, counter-piracy, maritime environmental pollution control, and even maritime legislation. It ranks as the 5th largest supplier of global skilled manpower. In fact, the skill sets of Indian seafarers, primarily at the officers level, are highly coveted and are much sought after. It is one of the best infrastructure facilities for quality maritime education, training, and certification. And India is also deeply committed to various international maritime legal instruments of the United Nations, the International Maritime Organization, the International Labour Organization, and the host of the UN bodies. In fact, it ranks as one amongst the few countries which has the highest levels of ratification of UN conventions across the globe. Now, to fast forward, let me just briefly encapsulate the Mauritian maritime profile as I perceive it. The blue economy has been the critical plank of the economic development strategy of Mauritius. It has, as an underpinning, an integrated coastal zone management and marine spatial planning as key pillars of its maritime strategies. And besides, the fishery sector and marine tourism are also its core USPs. Let me then just, take you through what I would want to project as potential areas for collaboration, not just bilaterally interstate between India and Mauritius, but on a plurilateral level, which is regional, and significantly also then eventually culminating at the international forum. I have about 15 points and I'll try and encapsulate as swiftly as I possibly can. Much has been already spoken by some of my predecessor panelists in regard to the scourge of maritime piracy. Mercifully, we've been able to cap it, if not eliminate it, exterminate it completely since July 2012, barring sporadic incidents. But I have a more significant recommendation to make here. We've had this very successful international body arising out of the United Nations Security Council resolution of February 2009 in the form of the architecture of the Contact Group on Piracy off the coast of Somalia. It's done yeoman service. There have been very significant derivative learnings for countries and also for various regional bodies. But I think the time has come for us to look at trying to amplify the mandate or the remit of the CGPCS through a feasible amendment of the UN Security Council resolution to cast a mandate to give it a 360 degrees scanning perspective, so that no matter where maritime piracy hotspots arise, the CGPCS has the geographical bandwidth to be able to intercede and apply intervention solutions, which it has done successfully over the last decade of its existence. Here, let me just qualify, more by way of a clarification, and I mean no offense. When we look at piracy, in terms of the provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, we need to address merely the template of piracy and not get into discussions or discourse on armed robbery, which is premised on the fact that in terms of the UNCLOS, armed robbery is confined to maritime security incidents which take place within the territorial waters, that is a zone of 12 nautical miles of every country. So that is within the domain of every sovereign jurisdiction or country, really. So piracy is what we need to be addressing for its collateral implications. We also, there was a reference earlier, and I'm glad that came up. This was Captain Sarabjit Parmar did mention about the proposition of the floating armories. And I may say this with utmost humility and due deference, that when I was the Director General of Shipping in 2015 and 2016 in the Government of India, I had drafted and initiated a paper where I had advocated very ardently for putting in place international standard organization standards for for floating armories, so as to regulate them and bring them within a certain framework of control. And this was premised on the analogy of the ISO 28007 standards that are applicable for privately contracted armed security personnel and private maritime security companies. So it's a doable proposition. Unfortunately, it's been hanging fire. It's time that India, Mauritius, and the I.R.S countries address, because the collateral damage that can befall if there is no leash on floating armories is incalculable, and I think it's immeasurable. So this is an area where I think we need to closely collaborate. There are the third, the prop which I just wanted to address here is that there is a need to address and bring about more harmonized collaboration between India, Mauritius, and the I.R.S countries in terms of the convergence of our approaches at various levels in the International Maritime Organization and the International Labour Organization. And I think here the thrust ought to be, amongst other things, to try and facilitate and promote the welfare of seafarers and fishers, including under the Torremolinos Convention. The reason why I'm arguing in the defense of seafarers and fishers is that this pandemic has driven home singularly the criticality of the fact that the simple issue of sign-on and sign-off of seafarers from various ports has become such an enormous challenge. Several maritime nations have been singularly derelict, have refused to permit sign-on and sign-off. And as a result, seafarers are left holding the wrong end of the stick, as it were. They're sailing for months on end, some of them close to about a year. And there is only so much that in terms of physical and mental capacity of a seafarer before it reaches a breakdown point. And that, to my mind, has very significant ramifications on maritime safety and maritime security. We can only disregard seafarers' interests in situations like this at the peril of holistic maritime safety and security. So it's time that the clarion call which the UN, the IMO has made to declare seafarers as key workers is well heeded and regarded timely by various nations. There is also a need for us to look at, working far more closely than what has been done so far within the I.R.S template. And this is to promote the concept of sustainable shipping. The fifth element which I would want to sort of propagate here is with reference to climate change, where there was a reference from one of my fellow panel speakers to the UN SDGs. And this is where I think under the UN SDG framework of 2015 to 2030, which is the climate agenda, we have each jurisdiction member state of the UN has committed itself to declare what its nationally determined contributions are under the UN SDGs and make a declaration to the UN from time to time. I think here are strands within the respective NDCs, which can be shared in terms of shared learnings, experiential learnings, and best practices amongst countries in the I.R.S framework. The sixth element which I would like to advocate here is the dire need to address holistically marine environmental pollution control measures, including more robust oil spill disaster response management systems, including, and this is where I would want to sort of underscore, the commonly shared OSROs. OSRO is an acronym for Oil Spill Response Organizations. It is now empirically established that you need to have a very prompt response mitigation mechanism in the event of an oil spill, which can be absolutely catastrophic to the marine ecosystem of any littoral country. And more often than not, most oil spills tend to have ramifications beyond the territorial waters and spill over to the larger maritime domain. And this is where there is a need for a rethink on having shared resource-based platforms, particularly with reference to the OSROs. Then the seventh element which I wanted to emphasize here is India has been one amongst the pioneers of a mechanism known as the LRIT, the Long Range Identification and Tracking System for merchant ships. And we have offered services of the LRIT architecture virtually for gratis to most other member nations, the developing and the least developed countries. And we are more than happy to collaborate. I recall we had 2 bilateral agreements during my tenure as Director General of Shipping. Essentially, the LRIT is a mechanism which enables every maritime jurisdiction to have a complete maritime domain awareness. And this is a significant input which feeds into the architecture of maritime security. Similarly, we have now scaled up to the Indian regional national satellite systems, which is another factor which we can build on. In fact, India is only one amongst the 5 countries globally which has been able to develop both the LRIT and the IRNSS technologies, which we, as I said, we'll be more than happy to share on a very collaborative level. Now, the other element which I think which we ought not to lose sight is what do we do with reference to the fishing community, which is often neglected in all of these discussions. I think here we will be more than happy to share, and this is where I would pick up where Mr. Raj Mahabir left, as to which countries which can step forward and offer intervention solutions which are meaningful, in terms of whatever advances they have done. And this is where I want to just illustratively harp on a technology known as DATS, Distress Alert Transmission Signals. India has been able to develop completely indigenous DATS systems, which can be fitted, sometimes even retrofitted on fishing vessels. And this is something, if the Indian Ocean Commission, the I.R.S can possibly consider taking it up with the Government of India, I'm sure they'll be able to happily share the nuances of this technology. The ninth element would be the sharing of the enormous architecture of skill-based training, education, and certification and accreditation systems which India has built up over the years. As an add-on to this, I just wanted to highlight, during my tenure, and I'm saying this with utmost due deference, we were the first country off the block globally to introduce a smart tablet-based certificate of competency examination system. Nowhere else in the world was this tried, and we have succeeded in this, where the examinations for the career progression examinations for seafarers are done on a smart tablet, unlike an A4 sized traditional paper-based examination. We were the first to initiate this, and this has now gone beyond the beta travel, which is something which we'll be able to offer. The other thing where we were actually pioneers was the e-learning solutions for the merchant shipping sector. Happy to collaborate and offer this for gratis, to whichever country wants to take this forward. The 10th element, and I'll fast track this, is that, post the 9/11 incident which occurred in the US, which is a cataclysmic event which shook the world order, and this is where, the concept of a rule-based maritime order was sought to be introduced. And this was in terms of the ISPS, International Ship and Port Facility Security Code. Again, India has developed significant experience of having worked this system for the past 1.5 decades. And we've been able to scale it up to as many as 68 EXIM ports in the country. So the ISPS is a platform for maritime security where I think we can find common ground to share with. The 11th element, which I can probably underscore, is that there is a need for I.R.S to look at, and this is something that the Indian Ocean Commission can also converge, is to try and put in place a common pool of skilled maritime professionals and experts who are available across these geographies, whose talent and skills and experience and expertise can be leveraged project-specific or program-specific. You don't need to, reinvent the wheel if you have a going pool, which is frameworked within, let's say, the I.R.S. You just have to dip into these resources and then, have the services of these experts and professionals to be used for any project or any program that you wish in the maritime sector. There was a reference to various modus operandi and various manifestations of maritime crime, while terrorism has been, aptly sort of underscored here. But may I add here that the nuance of money laundering and terrorist financing, which is often lost sight of in all these discourses and dialogues, contextual to the maritime sector, is an element which I think bears no overemphasis. I remember my longish association with the CGPCS over 6 years of my tenure in the Directorate General of Shipping, which is India's National Maritime Administration and Flag Administration. And this is not a critique of the CGPCS. While it has done exceptional work on several fronts, I think there was not much to write home about with reference to the ransom payments in all of those multitude of cases of piracy which occurred in the Horn of Africa. I dare say that not even a single interdiction of money laundered from out of these cases has ever taken place. So this drives home the critical need for bringing the spotlight into maritime money laundering and financing of terrorism. There was also a reference, and I was glad to what Mr. Raj Mahabir mentioned about the potential for immense vulnerabilities which are there as a sitting duck in the maritime sector in terms of cyber attacks. This is an area where, I have been speaking on various fora. Often this has been sort of, pushed to the background because nobody wants to look at the elephant in the room, as it were. But the fact remains that the shipping sector is extremely pregnable, vulnerable to this. And nothing drives home the point than the last week's attack on a large merchant shipping vessel of one of the largest, the third largest container shipping company in the world, the CMA CGM. They were subject to a ransomware attack, which was christened as a Ragnar Locker ransomware attack before the vessel got released on payment of ransom. This is an area, and I see immense collateral damage going forward. And this is an area where you need to work upon. This is where I would advocate IOR and IOC to look at, because you will have in the next 10 years, and this is not, I'm not sort of prophesying, you will have autonomous and semi-autonomous merchant shipping happening in 10 to 20 years horizon from now. And when you have enormous infusion of information technology, artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, information communication technology, information technology enabled services, you will have the downsides in the form of cyber crimes. And I would not say that this is in the realms of fantasy. You may not have physical hijacks anymore of merchant ships. You could have cyberjacking of vessels. Vessels could, the master could lose complete control of a ship, by remote controlled ransomware introduced, and he would not know what on earth is happening to his ship. And this is a scenario which is waiting to happen. And this is an area where, which should underpin the efforts on maritime security. IMO is doing significant work, but I think there's a need for a sharper focus at a regional level to this. And of course, India has made significant strides in the port sector and the cruise tourism. In fact, Mumbai has become, in the last 2 to 3 years, a significant hub port for a hub and spoke model of cruise tourism. This is another offering which we can make. And penultimately, and just to leave this as a thought, an area which has been oft neglected is the implications of enforcement of the UN Security Council resolution sanctions. There are multiple sanctions, as many as sanctions. There are 17 groups which administer sanctions of the UNSC, and they have targets of around 686 individuals, close to about 340 organizations. But it's often not known, and it's a pity that several of these UN sanctions have serious maritime implications. And this is in the form of the fact that when you have cargoes which are prohibited or proscribed and are deemed as illicit, for example, charcoal export from Somalia illustratively is prohibited. But I had the misfortune of dealing, as in my tenure as Director General of Shipping, 72 Indian merchant vessels which fell foul of the UN sanctions. And that's when it dawned on me that it's time that, the merchant shipping world looked at the entire phalanx or the ecosystem of maritime sanctions and the potential damage. There was another instance where I had to deal with, oil which was prohibited to be shipped from Libya, from a government which was not recognized by the UN, and that was a cargo which I had to then deal with, and that's for a different day. The point I'm trying to make is that the UN Security Council sanctions are an absolute area for focus which should come in here. The last two are relatively smaller points which I just wanted to bring in here is that, there was a mention about the fact that you need to have data and information deposits. I may happily share with you from out of my 6 years tenure in the Directorate General of Shipping, 4 years as a second-in-command officer as Additional Director General, and finally as 2 years as head of the National Maritime Administration's Director General. We have one of the finest repositories of data, exhaustive and up-to-date insofar as the merchant shipping world goes. And I'm sure my successors would be more than happy through the normal process, diplomatic process, to share that repository of data. And finally, on the fact that, you have way too many players operating on the maritime domain front. And that this is where, most of those who are seasoned players are aware of a mechanism known as SHADE, which is housed out of Bahrain. The acronym stands for Shared Awareness and Deconfliction. Unfortunately, what has happened is that, except for its piracy nuances, this is a mechanism which I think needs to be embraced in fora like the IORA and the IOC, where you need to ensure that, potential escalation of conflicts from out of multitude of players operating, well-meaning legitimate players operating in the maritime space, is then diffused in very quick real time. So I think I can possibly go on, but I think I need to put the pause button. I once again thank Binding Bharat for this opportunity afforded to me to share my insights. And thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for your extremely patient hearing. And I'll be glad to field any questions if there are in the Q&A session to follow. Thank you once again.
Thank